You're why Mom suffered." Thomas's voice didn't shake. It sliced through the air like a verdict. Calvin froze, the coffee cup trembling in his old hands. For a second, he thought his son was joking. Grief talking, anger talking, anything but the truth. But the way Thomas looked at him, it wasn't anger. It was certainty. On the kitchen table lay a yellowed envelope, edges curled, the name Mary written in her delicate hand. Thomas pushed it toward him. "I found it in her old piano bench," he said. "You should read it. Maybe you'll finally understand what you did." Calvin's pulse roared in his ears. For years he'd carried the guilt quietly. The nights she cried alone. The mornings she smiled through the pain. He told himself she forgave him. He told himself love was stronger than regret. But when he broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter, his world tilted. The handwriting was hers. The words were tender. But the name at the top was not his. "To Daniel, the only one who ever saw me." The room spun. The floor seemed to vanish beneath him, and for the first time in his life, Calvin realized his son might be right. He was the reason she suffered. Follow, because what Calvin uncovers next will shatter everything he thought he knew about love, loyalty, and truth. He could still remember the first day he met Mary, the sunlight pooling on the church steps, her hair catching every ray like spun gold. She laughed at something trivial, he said, a laugh so bright it drowned out the small-town gossip, the weight of expectation, the loneliness of a man who had built walls out of books and silence. They married young, 24 and 22. Calvin was already in med school, obsessed with anatomy charts and sleepless nights. Mary taught piano to neighborhood kids and filled the house with melodies that softened the sterile edges of his ambition. Their home smelled of coffee, varnish, and hope. For years, they were that couple, the quiet kind, dependable, always smiling in Christmas photos. But in every frame, Calvin's hand was just slightly hesitant on her shoulder, as if afraid she might drift away if he held too tight. Then came the small absences. First, missed dinners. Then the piano lessons that ran a little late. Calvin never doubted her. He was too busy saving strangers to notice he was losing the only person who truly needed him. He remembered one night, the sound of rain and Mary sitting by the window, her fingers tracing the glass. "You ever feel," she said softly, "like you're in a room full of people and still no one's really there?" He'd looked up from his notes, half listening. "That's just the rain talking," he said, smiling. She didn't smile back. It was such a small thing, that silence. But years later, when he thought of all that followed, the distance, the secrets, the slow erosion of tenderness, that silence felt like the first crack in the foundation. By the time Thomas was born, Mary had already learned to hide her sadness behind motherhood. She was a good mother, the kind who stayed up through fevers, who hummed lullabies even when her own hands trembled. But Calvin often caught her staring at the child, with an expression he couldn't quite name, something between love and apology. He used to tell himself every marriage has its quiet seasons, that love doesn't fade, it just changes form. But the truth is, it did fade. Not all at once, but piece by piece. Like music that plays softer and softer until you realize it's gone. And somewhere along the way, the man who promised to heal others forgot how to listen to the woman who healed him. It started with her suitcase, the small brown one she used for volunteer trips. The first time she left, Calvin helped her pack. She told him she was traveling with the church to visit recovering patients in the next state. He kissed her cheek, proud of her compassion. But when the trips became frequent, every few months, then every few weeks, something inside him began to shift. Not suspicion, not yet. Just an ache. The kind that comes from realizing you no longer know what your spouse dreams about. When she returned, her eyes always looked older. There was warmth in her smile, but also something guarded, like a secret she'd sworn to protect. Thomas was only 6 then. He would run to her with drawings and laughter, and she'd hold him so tightly it almost hurt to watch. Calvin once asked, "You sure you're not taking on too much?" Mary just laughed, brushing her hair behind her ear. "Helping people isn't heavy, Cal. It's what keeps me breathing." But sometimes, late at night, he'd wake to find her sitting at the piano, playing a melody he didn't recognize. Slow, mournful, and full of unfinished notes. She would stop when she noticed him and whisper, "Go back to sleep." There were other signs, too. Letters arriving without return addresses. A phone call she took outside in the rain. A photograph of a seaside hospital tucked inside her journal. Calvin told himself he was imagining things. Doctors see ghosts where there are none. That's what he believed. Until the night she collapsed. It was early spring, 2016. The daffodils outside hadn't bloomed yet. She'd just returned from another trip, thinner, paler, but smiling. He found her in the kitchen, humming softly as she made tea. Then, without warning, her body folded like paper. The porcelain cup shattered against the tiles. At the hospital, he sat by her bed for 3 days, the monitors tracing the fragile rhythm of a heart he thought he knew. She woke once, looked at him, and whispered, "Promise me, Calvin. If you can't forgive me, at least forgive yourself." He tried to ask what she meant, but her eyes closed again, and she never opened them after that. After the funeral, he discovered her journal, but he couldn't bring himself to read it. Grief is strange. It makes you afraid of answers. For years, he lived like that, haunted by half-finished melodies, by the ghost of her voice, by a promise he didn't understand. Until Thomas found the letter. Until her secret finally came home. The envelope sat between them like a live wire. When Thomas left, door slamming, engine coughing down the street, Calvin stayed at the table, rereading the letter until the words blurred. To Daniel, the only one who ever saw me. Each sentence felt like a small betrayal wearing a kind voice. Each comma, a hesitation she must have lived inside for years. He steadied his hands and turned the envelope over. Postmark, Newport, March 2016, 1 week before she collapsed. Newport. They'd never vacationed there. He reached for the kitchen drawer where Mary used to hide spare keys and recipes and sometimes things that scared her. Tucked under a faded oven mitt, he found an old leather pouch. Inside, a travel-size bottle of perfume, a folded bus schedule with the coastal line circled in red, and a receipt. Bay Lantern Inn. 2 nights. Cash. Cash. Mary hated carrying cash. He stood in their quiet house and listened, to dust settling, to the long pause of a home after a truth is spoken. Then he took the letter and the pouch to his office, a room that still smelled faintly of antiseptic and cedar. He powered on his ancient desktop. The screen woke with a groan. He hadn't opened Mary's email in years. After she passed, he couldn't even bear to see her name in the from line. Now, he searched the archive with fingers that trembled like a novice. 2. Self-subject. Notes. Date, March 12, 2016. It wasn't an email, not really. It was a draft, unsent, a message to no one. 3 lines. He says the new protocol is risky. They warned us about certain doctors. If I can't carry this alone, I will ruin him. Calvin leaned back, the chair creaking. Protocol. Doctors. Ruin him. Who was him? Daniel? Or him? His own name felt like a diagnosis he didn't want to hear. He printed the draft, then pulled the box of old photographs down from the closet. Mary kept everything: birthday cards, ticket stubs, piano recital programs with little coffee stains on the corner. Around the bottom, he found a handful of 4x6 prints in a paper sleeve. The first was a blurry photo of a shoreline, gray and cold. The second, the entrance to a hospital, St. Elora Recovery, the name half-cropped but readable. The third, the inside of a cafe across from the hospital. In the reflection of the window, a woman with Mary's hair, Mary's posture, Mary's habit of twisting her ring when she thought no one was looking. On the back of the cafe photo, in Mary's small, neat handwriting, Tuesday, 11:40 a.m. He checked the bus schedule. The coastal line arrived in Newport at 11:25 a.m. on Tuesdays. The next morning, he drove. The sky was thin and pale. He didn't play the radio. He didn't call Thomas. He rehearsed questions in his head and rehearsed not crying when the answers came. Newport smelled like salt and rusted rails and something medicinal that clung to the air near St. Elora. The hospital entrance was cleaner than in the photograph, but the benches were the same, steel slats that remembered winter. Inside, he approached the reception desk. The woman behind the glass had the patient gaze of someone who'd spent too many years hearing bad news. Calvin introduced himself, the name doctor tasting sour in his mouth. "I'm looking for visitor logs from March 2016, he said. A Mary Whitaker." He hated saying her maiden name. It made her sound like a stranger he'd never met. The woman glanced at a calendar that wasn't there. "We keep physical logs for that year," she said carefully. "You family?" He nodded. She disappeared through a door and returned with a binder whose spine had cracked in surrender. Calvin felt his own spine mirror it. He ran his finger down columns of names and dates until the ink swam. There, March 8th, Mary Whitaker, visiting, D. Hale. A patient number followed, and a note in different handwriting: consult RIA trial eligibility. D. Hale. The name meant nothing. It meant everything. Trial eligibility. "Can I ask what kind of trial?" he said, too fast. The receptionist paused. Rules pressed up against sympathy inside her. "I can't share records," she said, "but sometimes community clinics post public notices." She slid a stapled leaflet across the glass as if it had slipped. "We had a partnership that spring. Outside specialist advising. There were complications." The leaflet was a bland announcement with a list of dates and a logo that used to make Calvin proud. Whitaker Medical Group, Outreach Initiative. His fingers went cold. He felt like he'd stepped into a photograph and found himself standing in the background. Back in his car, he reread the leaflet until the letters could have been anyone's language. Outreach, specialist, complications. His name, not printed, but implied in the brand he'd built and then outlived. He tried to remember March 2016. He was still consulting back then, a couple of days a month. There had been whispers about a new protocol for treatment-resistant depression, a cocktail that blurred lines between research and mercy. He'd cautioned against it, publicly. Privately, he'd listened to a pitch that sounded too much like playing God. At home, he dumped the contents of the leather pouch onto the desk again. The Bay Lantern receipt. The bus ticket with the coastal line circled. The perfume. A small key he hadn't noticed before fell out and rang like a bell on the wood. It was stamped. P.O. Box 239. He drove to the post office before talking himself out of it. The clerk was older, kind, with a veteran's ring. Calvin showed him the key. "My wife passed," he said. "I found this among her things. I'm trying to return it." The clerk studied the key and shrugged. "Box expired years ago. If anything got left, it would have been moved to dead mail." He disappeared into a back room. When he returned, he held a thin manila envelope with 239 scrawled on top. "Unclaimed," he said. "Happens." Inside were 2 items: a photocopy of an informed consent form with Mary's signature beside another name, Daniel Hale, and a receipt for a cash transfer. $2,500 monthly, starting January 2016. In the margin of the consent form, Mary had written one sentence in pencil, so faint he almost missed it. "He warned me about him, but I can't let Calvin pay again." Again. The word left a taste like metal. Calvin stood in the parking lot with the envelope in his hands and the wind clawing at his coat. Somewhere in town, a foghorn moaned, low and tired. He looked at Mary's name, at the other name, at the dates that lined up too perfectly with the weeks she said she was helping. The story he'd told himself for years, gentle, tragic, simple, began to rip at the seams. At the bottom of the manila envelope, a business card clung like an afterthought. St. Elora Recovery, Clinical Liaison L. Morton, a number, an address. On the back, in Mary's script, "If something happens, tell him the truth. Don't let them bury it." Calvin closed his eyes. They had buried everything. And now, it was coming back up. The next morning, Calvin drove to the address on the business card. A small rehabilitation center 2 towns over, its walls faded by salt wind and time. St. Elora Recovery, Clinical Liaison L. Morton. The sign creaked like an old confession. A nurse at the reception desk looked up when he entered. "Can I help you?" He showed the card. "I'm looking for L. Morton. It's about a former patient, Daniel Hale." Her eyes softened, then dimmed. "You're late," she said quietly. "Mr. Morton passed away last year. Stroke." The air left his lungs. He hesitated, then asked, "Do you know if there's anyone else who worked with him in 2016? She nodded toward a back hallway. "Room 12, Dr. Carver. She was part of the old outreach team. If she's in a good mood, she'll talk." Room 12 smelled faintly of alcohol swabs and old carpet. A woman in her 50s sat behind a desk littered with folders. When Calvin introduced himself, she raised an eyebrow. "Whitaker?" she repeated. "As in the Whitaker? The program sponsor?" He froze. "Mary, my wife, was connected to one of your patients, Daniel Hale. I'm trying to understand how." Dr. Carver leaned back, studying him. "You're a little late for understanding, Doctor, but I remember her." He waited. "She came in quiet," Carver continued. "Said she was here to help with the emotional side of patient recovery. But the truth? She was here to see one person. Daniel was part of the experimental trial you greenlit, the Mercy Protocol. Dangerous stuff, even back then." Calvin's mouth went dry. "I never approved human testing." Carver's gaze didn't waver. "Maybe not officially, but Morton had your notes. The formulation was yours. He said you wanted to save people the slow way. She wanted to save one man fast." He felt his stomach turn. "You mean Daniel?" Carver nodded. "They were close. Not romantic, at least not that I saw. More like 2 people clinging to the same wound. She thought he'd die if she didn't help him. He thought you'd destroy her career if she told you what she was doing. He stared at the floor, at the cracks in the linoleum. He warned me about him, Mary had written. Him. Was that Daniel? Or was it himself she feared? The man who built walls out of ethics and forgot how to love without measuring risk. Carver slid open a drawer and pulled out a file. Morton kept this locked up. After he died, we found it with his personal effects. Maybe it belongs to you. Inside the file was a faded photograph. Mary sitting beside a hospital bed, her hand on a man's wrist, Daniel's face turned away. Beneath it, a patient form marked, "Discharged, March 10th, 2016. He left that week, Carver said. Checked himself out. 2 days later, Mary called Morton in tears. Said she'd done something she couldn't undo. What? Carver shook her head. I don't know. The call wasn't recorded. But if you want proof, the cafe across the street had cameras. Morton used to brag about catching people sneaking cigarettes there. That afternoon, Calvin found the cafe. Harbor grounds, small, quiet, unchanged. The manager let him review old footage stored on cloud archives. He scrolled through hours of static and faces until Mary appeared, sitting by the window, across from a man, Daniel Hale. But what caught Calvin's breath wasn't the meeting. It was the third figure entering the frame 20 seconds later. L. Morton. He sat down beside them, papers in hand. Mary looked terrified. Daniel stood up, shouting something that never reached the camera's mic. Then Mary grabbed his arm, pleading, and Morton pointed to the papers. Daniel tore them in half, stormed out, and Mary, left alone, pressed her palms to her face. The timestamp read March 8th, 2016, 11:42 a.m., 2 days before she died. He copied the clip onto a drive and drove home under a sky that wouldn't stop raining. By the time he stepped through the door, Thomas was already there, waiting, his phone in hand, eyes raw with sleeplessness. You went digging, didn't you? Thomas said. I saw the withdrawal alerts from Mom's old account. You paid him, didn't you? Thomas, you let her die to protect yourself. His voice broke, but he didn't stop. You and your damn reputation. She was trying to save someone, and you made her choose. Calvin reached for him, but Thomas stepped back. His hands trembled. I found the old voicemail, Thomas whispered. The one she left that night. You never deleted it. You just pretended it wasn't there. Calvin's chest tightened. What voicemail? Thomas's thumb hovered over the phone. The one where she says, I can't hide it anymore. He'll find out everything. He hit play. Mary's voice filled the room, small and cracking. Calvin, I didn't want this to hurt you. But if something happens, promise me you'll look in the drawer. You'll see why I had to choose. Static. Then silence. Thomas's gaze burned through him. She was afraid of you. Calvin's answer came too late and too quiet to matter. No, son, she was afraid for me. But the door had already slammed shut. The hospital hadn't changed much. The same pale green walls, the same antiseptic hum in the air that made every breath taste like memory. St. Augustine Medical Center. The place where Mary had died. Calvin hadn't set foot inside since that morning 9 years ago. He could still see the hallway, the soft blur of nurses moving like ghosts around her bed. He'd memorized every beep of the monitor, every uneven breath. He'd told himself she died peacefully, that her body simply gave out. But standing there now, that version of peace felt like a lie. He went to records first. Mary Whitaker, March 2016, he said, voice steady. The clerk blinked. That's a restricted case, doctor. I know. I signed the death certificate. The woman hesitated, then gestured toward the elevator. Try the 6th floor. Ask for Nurse Delaney. She was on duty that week. Nurse Delaney was older now. Gray hair, soft eyes. The kind of kindness that comes only from years of watching people break and hold themselves together again. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. I wondered when you'd come, she said. She told me you might. Calvin's heart lurched. Mary? Delaney nodded. 2 nights before she passed. She asked me to keep something safe. She reached into a drawer and took out a sealed envelope, yellowed by time. Said you'd understand when it was time. Calvin opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a short note in Mary's handwriting. If you're reading this, I couldn't tell you the truth myself. Daniel wasn't my secret. You were. They were going to charge you for what you did to save him. I signed the forms so they'd come for me instead. The room went quiet, except for the slow, awful sound of air leaving Calvin's lungs. Delaney watched him, voice gentle. She wasn't protecting him, doctor. She was protecting you. The medication trial, she took the blame. Said she'd falsified his records. But the truth was, she'd only done it to stop the investigation from reaching your name. Calvin's throat burned. She died because of me. Delaney shook her head. She died for you. There's a difference. He sank into a chair, clutching the paper as if it might dissolve. Every memory of her, the quiet eyes, the distant smiles, the lines she'd said before she fell asleep that final night, came flooding back. If you can't forgive me, at least forgive yourself. All these years, he thought she meant the affair, the betrayal, the silence. But she had meant the sacrifice. Delaney placed a hand on his shoulder. When the investigators came, she told them she'd acted alone. She knew her heart was failing. She said it was her choice. Why didn't anyone tell me? She made me promise not to. Said it would destroy what little of you was left. He stared at the letter again, the trembling loops of her handwriting, the word you underlined twice. His chest ached with the weight of understanding. Do you know what happened to Daniel? He asked quietly. Delaney sighed. He got clean, left town. Last I heard, he was working with a community clinic in Chicago, under a new name. Calvin exhaled, the sound between a sob and a prayer. She really saved us both. Delaney smiled faintly. She said once, love isn't about who you die for. It's about who you forgive before you go. I didn't understand it then. Maybe you will now. When Calvin stepped outside, the late afternoon sun hit him like a verdict and a blessing all at once. The hospital doors closed behind him with the soft click of finality. He sat in his car for a long time, the letter trembling in his lap. Somewhere, a church bell rang, faint, distant, like her laugh echoing from another life. He finally whispered, "You didn't hide from me, Mary. You saved me." For the first time in years, Calvin wept without shame. The living room smelled like cinnamon and old furniture polish, a Sunday truce disguised as a family brunch. Photos lined the mantel. Calvin in his white coat, Mary at the piano, Thomas gap-toothed and grinning beside a birthday cake shaped like a soccer ball. Aunt Ruth carried in a casserole as if hot food could weld people together. Cousin Eli poured coffee with the zeal of an usher. Everyone spoke too cheerfully, the way people do when they're afraid the room will hear what they really think. Calvin stood at the doorway holding the envelope from Nurse Delaney, Mary's letter, the one that turned guilt into something heavier. Debt. He hadn't told Thomas. Not yet. He wanted to choose his timing, to place the truth into his son's hands gently, like you might pass a newborn across a chasm. But Thomas arrived with an agenda you couldn't cradle. He came in late, jaw set, a backpack slung over one shoulder. No greetings, no small talk, just the hard light of purpose in his eyes. He didn't sit. He didn't eat. He went straight to the TV, plugged in an HDMI cable, and set his phone on the mantel beneath Mary's favorite photo. "Before we pretend we're fine," Thomas said, voice steady. "We're going to watch something." Aunt Ruth faltered with the casserole. "Thomas, honey, this won't take long." He clicked play. The video opened on the cafe window at Harbor Grounds, the same angle Calvin had stared at 100 times the night before. Mary by the glass, Daniel across from her, their faces turned in that worried tilt two people share when something larger than them is pulling the strings. Then Morton entered the frame. The room went very quiet except for the soft clink of ceramic against ceramic as someone set a cup down too hard. "What is this?" Eli asked. "Evidence," Thomas said. "Mom meeting her patient, the man Dad paid off, the man he let her die to protect." Calvin's hand tightened around the envelope in his coat. Thomas. But his son wasn't looking at him. He was looking at the version of Mary on the screen who pressed her palms to her face after Daniel stormed out. The timestamp glowed in the corner. 0308, 2016, 11:42. 2 days before she collapsed. Aunt Ruth sank into a chair. "Mary," she whispered, as if saying the name might conjure a kinder ending. Thomas paused the video and turned to the room. "You all think he's a saint," he said, nodding toward Calvin. "But Mom was paying someone, monthly, cash. I have the withdrawals." And when she called him that night, he tapped the phone. She said, "He'll find out everything." She was scared. Of who? Of him. The word him hit the room like a dropped plate. Calvin stepped forward. "Thomas, I know what it looks like. But you're missing—" "I'm missing my mother," Thomas snapped. His face flushed, then cooled in a blink. A dangerous weather change. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a folder. Contracts. The Outreach Initiative. The Mercy Protocol Dad warned the board about and then secretly consulted on. He didn't want a scandal, so he let Mom take the fall. "How do you even have those?" Eli asked, half awed, half afraid. "Public records," Thomas said, "and a journalist who actually returns emails." Calvin felt the room tilt. He could see how it looked from Thomas's side of the table. Timelines that lined up too perfectly. Payments that smelled like guilt. A mother who died with a secret and a husband who signed the certificate. He reached into his coat and touched the envelope. Not yet. Not like this. Aunt Ruth stood. "Enough," she said, voice trembling. "This is a family home. We don't do trials in living rooms." Thomas didn't flinch. "Then let's do it in the open." He lifted his phone and mirrored to the TV again. This time, a recording none of them had seen. Mary's voicemail. The room braced itself. "Calvin, I didn't want this to hurt you, but if something happens, promise me you'll look in the drawer. You'll see why I had to choose." The silence afterward was cruel. It sounded like every apology that came too late. Thomas looked at Calvin. "Well, did you look in the drawer? Or did you just bury it like everything else?" "I looked," Calvin said softly. "And I found more than you think." "Then show us." Thomas spread his hands to the room. "Show all of us. Right now." The family's eyes shifted to Calvin, not accusing, not yet, but hungry for a truth that could end the drought. He saw Mary at the piano in his mind, the way her fingers hovered over a soft chord and waited for resolve. He pulled the Delaney envelope from his coat and set it on the coffee table. The paper seemed to glow. "This is from your mother," he said. "And from the nurse who watched her die, trying to keep me from becoming a man I couldn't live with." Thomas scoffed. "More riddles." "No," Calvin said, his voice steadied. "A confession, not hers, mine." He didn't open the envelope yet. Instead, he reached for the remote, rewound the cafe footage, and pressed pause on Mary's face mid-breath. "If you're going to judge me," he said to the room, "judge me after you hear all of it. Judge me after you know what she did, not to betray me, but to protect me." The doorbell rang. The room startled. Thomas frowned. "I didn't invite anyone." Aunt Ruth shuffled toward the foyer. When she opened the door, a woman in a weathered blazer stood there, hair pulled back, press badge clipped to her lapel. She held a small recorder and the kind of cautious sympathy reporters wear when they're about to pour gasoline on grief. "Mr. Whitaker?" she called from the threshold. "I'm Lydia North, the Herald. You asked for a follow-up. I have something you need to see." Every head turned to Calvin. He exhaled. "Let her in." Because if the truth was going to break the room, it might as well break clean. Lydia North stepped into the room like someone walking into the eye of a storm. Calm, but fully aware the walls might explode at any moment. She gave a polite nod to the relatives now frozen mid-sentence, their Sunday smiles gone brittle. "I'm sorry for intruding," she said, eyes flicking toward the paused image of Mary on the TV. "But this can't wait." Thomas folded his arms. "You're the reporter who ran that hit piece on my dad last year, right? The one who called him a fraud?" Lydia didn't blink. "I also corrected it." She turned to Calvin. "And what I found after the retraction changes everything." Calvin gestured for her to continue. His voice was calm, but his fingers trembled slightly against the armrest. "Say it here. My family deserves to know what you know." Lydia pulled a small envelope from her satchel and laid it on the coffee table right next to Mary's letter. "That," she said, "came from a source at St. Elora's archive. It's the unredacted version of your wife's discharge report." Thomas frowned, arms tightening. "Discharge report. She wasn't even a patient." Lydia met his gaze. "That's the part no one ever checked. She was a patient for exactly 72 hours. The room went utterly still. She opened the file. A photograph slipped free. Mary in a hospital gown, hair tied back, holding a clipboard. Date stamp, March 9th, 2016. "She checked herself in under the name M. Hale," Lydia said softly. "According to the attending physician, she volunteered to take part in the trial your father had warned against, the same one your mother claimed she wanted to monitor. But the logs show she didn't monitor it. She underwent it." Thomas's mouth opened, then closed. No. She wasn't sick." "She was," Calvin said quietly. "Her heart was failing. She didn't tell anyone, not even me." Lydia nodded. "According to the internal notes, she asked for 1 dose. The same compound Daniel Hale had taken. The staff tried to stop her. Morton signed off, said she'd insisted. 3 hours later, her vitals crashed. She refused a transfer, said it was her choice." Calvin closed his eyes. He could still hear Mary's voice. "If you can't forgive me, at least forgive yourself." Thomas shook his head, voice cracking. "No, She wouldn't, she wouldn't do that. Lydia slid another paper across the table, a handwritten addendum from Nurse Delaney. She left this note in her file the day before she died. Thomas leaned forward to read, his lips moving as he whispered the words. If anyone asks, tell them I did this for him. Not because I stopped loving him, but because I never could. He stared at the sentence, trying to breathe around it. For him, he repeated faintly. She meant you. Calvin nodded, his face a mask of grief and relief colliding. She took the treatment to stop the investigation. The compound was mine, Thomas. If she'd admitted that, they would have come for me. She took the blame and the risk. Thomas pushed away from the table, pacing. You're saying Mom died to protect you from… what? Losing your license? No, Calvin said. From losing everything. Morton threatened to expose me. She thought if she proved the drug wasn't lethal, it would save us both. The room spun around Thomas. His mother's laughter from old home videos, the piano songs she used to hum, the late-night phone calls she claimed were students, all began to blur into something else entirely. Not deceit, desperation. Aunt Ruth wiped her eyes with the edge of her apron. Oh, Mary. But Thomas wasn't ready to surrender. Then why the payments? The letters to Daniel? The lies? Lydia answered before Calvin could. She was funding his rehabilitation. The $1,500 transfers were for Daniel's therapy sessions after he left St. Elora. I verified the invoices myself. The silence that followed was heavy, almost sacred. The kind that makes you realize how long you've been wrong about someone you love. Calvin finally spoke. She kept you safe, Thomas. From the scandal, from the truth. She wanted you to remember her as strong, not as a woman cleaning up her husband's mistakes. Thomas stared at him, his anger cracking like dry paint. All these years, I hated you for what she chose. Calvin's eyes glistened, and I punished myself for what she never blamed me for. The journalist exhaled softly, glancing toward the door. You should know, this isn't over. Once this file is public, people will want answers. Calvin nodded slowly, then let them ask. For the first time, I'll answer. Thomas sank into a chair, the fight leaking out of him. He looked at the paused image of Mary on the TV, her hands over her face, and whispered, She was saving us both, wasn't she? Calvin nodded. Yes, and now it's our turn to save her name. Lydia slipped out quietly, leaving the house filled with the strange quiet that follows truth. Not peace, but the echo of something beginning to heal. But outside, a car engine idled. Someone had been listening, recording. When the door closed, a man across the street lowered a camera lens. The next strike was already coming. By dawn the next morning, the story was everywhere. Dr. Whitaker's wife was the real test subject, cover-up or sacrifice. The Mercy Protocol scandal. Did love turn lethal? Calvin's face was on every thumbnail, weary, caught mid-blink, framed beside Mary's smiling portrait like a cruel before and after. The video from the family gathering had gone viral overnight. Someone, maybe the man with the camera, had uploaded the entire confrontation. Thomas's accusations, Lydia's revelation, and Calvin's silence at the end. Out of context, it looked like guilt. It sounded like guilt. By the time Thomas saw it, it had 500,000 views. The comments burned. Another doctor hiding behind his dead wife. She paid for his mistakes. Literally. Rot in hell, Whitaker. He shut the laptop with a trembling hand. "They twisted it," he muttered, pacing the living room. "They think she was some kind of lab rat. They think you killed her." Calvin sat quietly by the window, still holding Mary's letter. He hadn't slept. He hadn't even changed out of yesterday's shirt. "Then we tell them the truth," he said simply. Thomas spun around. "The truth? They don't want the truth. They want a villain." "Then let me be it," Calvin said, rising. His voice was calm, but his eyes carried a strange clarity, the look of a man who's already lost everything but still chooses to walk back into the fire. "If that's what it takes to clear her name." Thomas frowned. "What are you talking about?" Calvin turned to the old oak desk in the corner, Mary's desk, and pulled out a worn tape recorder. He pressed play. A low hum filled the room, followed by his own voice, recorded days after Mary's death. "Statement, Dr. Calvin Whitaker, regarding Project Mercy." Thomas blinked. "You recorded a confession." "A reflection," Calvin corrected. "I couldn't bear to finish it back then. But now, it's time." He hit record again and spoke as the tape turned. "Mary Whitaker didn't die as a victim. She died protecting a man who forgot that mercy without courage is just cowardice. The compound was mine. The guilt is mine. But the choice, the sacrifice, was hers, and the world deserves to know she made it with love, not shame." When he stopped, Thomas stood frozen. "You're going to release that?" Calvin nodded. "To the same journalist who exposed us. Let the world hear her story in my voice." That afternoon, they drove together to the Herald's office, father and son, no longer enemies, but uneasy allies bound by grief. Lydia met them in the lobby, pale and sleepless. "It's bad out there," she said. "TV crews, legal threats, regulators. If you do this, there's no undoing it." Calvin handed her the tape. "Then don't undo it." By evening, the statement aired on the network's online feed. His voice cracked through 100 screens across the country. Mary didn't hide from the truth. She became it. If anyone must bear blame, let it be me. But remember her, not for how she died, but for what she saved. The public split in two. Some still called him a liar. Others began to ask different questions. About the hospital, about Morton, about how far a man should go to heal another. And for the first time since she died, Mary's name trended with a word that didn't sting. Hero. Late that night, Thomas found his father sitting on the porch steps, the glow of a single porch light reflecting off the wet pavement. "They're calling for an inquiry," Thomas said softly. "A full review of everything." Calvin nodded. "Good. Maybe the truth can finally breathe." Thomas hesitated. "I'm sorry for what I said, for what I thought." Calvin looked up, eyes glassy but gentle. "Don't be. You said what I'd been too afraid to admit. Sometimes the truth needs to hurt before it can heal." Thunder rolled somewhere far away. Rain began to fall, soft, cleansing, inevitable. Thomas sat beside him, silent. Then, almost a whisper, "You really loved her, didn't you?" Calvin smiled through the ache. "Every version of her. Even the one I never deserved." They stayed there long after the rain stopped. Two men listening to the echoes of a woman who had saved them both. And for the first time in years, Calvin didn't feel haunted. He felt forgiven. 2 weeks later, the first envelope arrived. No flowers this time, no condolences, just a letterhead stamped Whitaker Medical Group, Legal Affairs Division, and a line that read, "Notice of Inquiry. Unauthorized research, ethical misconduct, and negligent oversight." Calvin read it twice, then folded it neatly, as if politeness could dull its edge. Outside, news vans idled on the curb, reporters waiting like vultures for a fall that looked more like justice than tragedy. Thomas paced behind him. "They're reopening the Mercy Protocol case," he said. "They're saying you used Mom as a human experiment." Calvin didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the window, where rain streaked down in quiet lines, the same rhythm Mary used to tap when she was lost in thought. "Let them," he murmured. "If they want a hearing, they'll get the whole story." Thomas slammed his fist against the counter. "Dad, they're not after a story. They're after blood. The hospital's freezing your accounts. The insurance board's suspending your pension. You can't fight this alone." "I won't be alone." He turned. In the doorway stood Lydia North, trench coat dripping from the storm. "He's right," she said. "They want a scapegoat. Morton's dead, Carver's retired, and you're the only name left standing. I brought someone who can help." A tall man stepped forward, his suit immaculate but his expression weary. "I'm Graham Pierce, legal counsel, pro bono for now." He set a briefcase on the table. "Dr. Whitaker, I read the file. You're not just fighting the hospital. You're fighting their shareholders, the board, and a government review committee that smells blood in the water." Calvin gave a faint smile. "I've faced worse. The truth doesn't scare me anymore." Pierce sighed. "It should, because they're twisting it into a weapon." He opened the briefcase. Inside were copies of internal emails, subpoena notices, and one photograph, Mary's hospital intake form, red-stamped confidential. "They're arguing you knew she volunteered for the trial," Pierce said, "that you encouraged her to do it. Their angle is intent. If they prove you advised her, it's criminal negligence." Thomas's voice broke. "That's insane. He didn't even know she was sick." Pierce met his eyes. "They don't care about truth, son. They care about narrative. And right now, the narrative sells." Lydia placed a flash drive on the table. "This has the full interview with Nurse Delaney, unedited. If the public hears her words, it could shift everything." Pierce frowned. "Not in court. Testimonies outside discovery don't count." "Then leak it," Thomas said. "No," Calvin interrupted. "We won't fight lies with more noise. We'll fight them with proof." Pierce studied him. "Do you still have the original documents? The consent forms, the drafts, her signature?" Calvin hesitated. "I have everything she left me." "Good," Pierce said. "Because the board's building their case on the claim that those papers were forged after her death. They've hired a forensic analyst to testify the ink doesn't match the timeline." Calvin blinked. "Forged?" "Yes. And if they convince the court, you're not just a negligent husband. You're a fraud who tampered with evidence." The rain hammered harder. Lydia spoke softly. "There's one more thing. A sealed bank record, transferred after Mary's death. Someone's been moving funds out of the foundation account you set up in her name. The signature matches yours." Calvin frowned. "That's impossible. I haven't touched that account." Pierce nodded grimly. "Then someone else did, and they're using your name to prove intent. This isn't just about ethics anymore. It's about theft." Thomas turned pale. "Who would—" Calvin didn't answer. Because in his mind, one face surfaced from the haze. The man at the edge of every shadow in this story. Daniel Hale. He whispered the name like a wound reopening. "If they want the truth, we'll start there." Pierce closed his briefcase. Then we find him before they do. 3 days later, Calvin and Pierce stood in a cramped office on the south side of Chicago, where the walls smelled of burnt coffee and old confessions. The plaque on the door read, "Daniel Hale, Counseling Services." Thomas lingered in the hallway, shoulders tight, as if the air itself might accuse him. Calvin adjusted his coat and knocked. When the door opened, Daniel looked smaller than Calvin remembered from the grainy photos. Older, sober, the kind of man who'd learned that redemption isn't a gift. It's a tax you pay every day. His eyes widened, then dropped to the floor. "Dr. Whitaker," he said, "I was wondering when you'd find me." Calvin's voice was steady, but the weight behind it could crack glass. "Then you know why I'm here." Daniel motioned to 2 worn chairs. "I know you want the money trail. And the truth." They sat. The office was cluttered with notebooks, recovery pamphlets, and a small photo of Mary at a community event, smiling, alive, untouched by scandal. Calvin's chest tightened. "She kept sending the payments even after she got sick," Daniel began. "She said it wasn't charity. It was her way of saying don't waste the life she fought for. When she died, the payments stopped. A month later, they started again. Same amount, same account. But it wasn't her." Pierce leaned forward. "Who signed them?" Daniel opened a folder and slid a bank statement across the table. The signature on the withdrawal line looked almost perfect. Looping, graceful. But the ink bled slightly, like imitation tears. Calvin stared. "That's my name." Daniel nodded. "Forged. Whoever did it knew your handwriting, or had samples of it." Pierce frowned. "The hospital records." "Morton?" Calvin asked. Daniel hesitated. "Morton's dead, but he had protégés. One of them, Dr. Lyle Carson, was with the foundation after you resigned. He handled all the financials. He was the one who called me after Mary passed." "What did he say?" Daniel's jaw clenched. He said, "The wrong Whitaker died." Thomas swore under his breath. Pierce was already typing notes on his tablet. "We can subpoena Carson's records, but if he's half as smart as Morton, he's covered his tracks. We'll need a motive stronger than greed." Daniel rose and went to a filing cabinet. From the bottom drawer, he pulled a small, locked box. "Maybe this helps." He opened it and handed Calvin a flash drive. "Before Mary died, she asked me to record a statement, in case the trial came back to haunt her. I never released it because it implicated too many people. But if you're already under investigation..." Calvin took the drive, the metal cool in his palm. "What does it say?" Daniel's eyes were glassy. "It says she knew exactly what she was doing, and that Morton and Carson pushed her to it." Pierce leaned back. "That's leverage. We use it in court." Daniel shook his head. "No, you don't use it. You show it. She deserves her voice back." 2 weeks later, the courtroom smelled of polish and power. Cameras flashed outside. Inside, whispers folded through the benches like smoke. Calvin sat between Pierce and Thomas, the flash drive burning a hole in his pocket. The prosecutor, a woman with a voice as sharp as her heels, circled like a hawk. "Dr. Whitaker," she said, "did you or did you not create the chemical compound used in the Mercy Protocol?" "Yes," he said. "And did you test it on a human subject without board approval?" "No." "Then how do you explain your wife's name on this consent form?" Calvin's throat tightened. "She signed it without my knowledge, to protect me." The prosecutor smirked. "Convenient? And the bank transfers, doctor? The ones made under your name after her death?" Calvin met her gaze. "Those weren't mine." She clicked a remote. A projector screen came alive with a scanned document, his forged signature magnified, gleaming like accusation. Expert analysis says otherwise. Pierce stood. Objection, the signature was tampered with. We have evidence suggesting internal fraud from the Foundation's financial officer, Dr. Lyle Carson. The judge lifted a brow. Evidence, counselor? Pierce nodded toward Thomas, who stood and handed over the flash drive. Exhibit D, a video recorded by Mary Whitaker before her death. The courtroom hushed. The lights dimmed slightly as the screen flickered to life. Mary's face appeared, pale, fragile, but composed. If you're seeing this, it means they've turned what was mercy into punishment. I agreed to the trial, not to protect myself, but to protect Calvin. They threatened to ruin his name, to destroy everything he built. I thought one life might be enough to save another. Her voice broke, soft, trembling. If the money moves after I'm gone, it's not from me. It's from them. And whoever finds this, please, tell my son his mother wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of what silence would cost. When the screen went black, no one moved. Even the prosecutor lowered her eyes. The judge cleared his throat softly. We'll adjourn until tomorrow. Outside, the sky split with thunder. And somewhere between grief and vindication, Calvin realized Mary's truth was finally breathing again. The next morning, the courthouse steps were a battlefield of flashbulbs and umbrellas. Reporters shouted questions through the rain. Microphones jutted forward like weapons. Calvin ignored them all. He walked with the steady calm of a man who'd already been judged, not by the world, but by the one person whose forgiveness mattered most. Inside, the air buzzed with tension. Pierce shuffled his notes, Thomas clenched his fists, and the prosecutor whispered urgently to an aide. Everyone knew the video had changed the game. Mary's testimony had broken something, not in the case, but in the lie that had held for years. When the judge entered, silence fell like glass shattering. Court is now in session, he said. Before we proceed, the prosecution has submitted new evidence. Pierce's brow furrowed. New evidence? On what grounds? The prosecutor stood, a faint smile cutting across her lips. On the grounds that Dr. Whitaker's own foundation has just filed an independent complaint for embezzlement and fraud. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Pierce turned sharply toward Calvin. What the hell? A bailiff carried forward a folder stamped with the logo of the Whitaker Foundation. Inside, internal memos, falsified financial transfers, and a sworn statement, signed by Dr. Lyle Carson. Dr. Whitaker knowingly authorized ongoing payments to conceal the illegal research conducted under the Mercy Protocol. Thomas shot to his feet. That's a lie. We have the footage. The judge banged the gavel. Order! Calvin sat very still, his jaw tightening. He could feel the weight of every eye on him. He didn't need to read the statement. He could already see Carson's hand all over it, polished, rehearsed, lethal. Pierce leaned in, whispering fiercely, "He's framing you to save himself. They'll pivot this whole case into financial misconduct, make you the scapegoat for Morton's records." Calvin's voice was quiet. Can they prove it? Pierce's hesitation was enough of an answer. The prosecutor continued, Your Honor, given these new allegations, we request an immediate injunction freezing all assets under Dr. Whitaker's name, including the Mary's Hope Foundation. Thomas's head snapped toward her. You can't take that. That's her legacy. But the judge's face was grim. Until these allegations are resolved, All related funds will remain under investigation. Calvin's breath caught. The foundation, the one thing that carried Mary's name in light, not scandal, was gone. Pierce stood. Your Honor, the defense requests time to verify the authenticity of these claims. Denied, the judge said. The Financial Board has already reviewed the documents. Effective immediately, control of Mary's hope transfers to the state until further notice. Thomas's voice cracked. You're punishing her for dying. Enough, Calvin said softly. He stood, straightening his coat as though preparing for the inevitable. Let them have it. Pierce turned, stunned. What are you doing? Ending this, Calvin said. If fighting means dragging her name back through the dirt, I'd rather lose everything. He stepped forward, addressing the court directly. You want a confession? Fine. I approved every line, every test, every risk. I signed what I shouldn't have. But my wife didn't die because of greed or guilt. She died because she loved a man who didn't deserve her forgiveness. If there's punishment to be given, give it to me. Just leave her name out of your mouths. The prosecutor blinked, caught off guard by the quiet conviction. You understand what you're admitting? Calvin smiled faintly. For once in my life, yes. The judge leaned forward, his tone softening. Dr. Whitaker, this hearing isn't a confession booth. No, Calvin said, but it's close enough. He placed Mary's handwritten letter on the stand. The ink had faded, but her words still burned clear. If you can't forgive me, at least forgive yourself. I'm done running from forgiveness, he said. The judge exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. Given the evidence and the conflicting testimonies, this court finds insufficient proof to proceed with criminal charges. Dr. Whitaker, you are free to go. Thomas's shoulders sagged with relief, but Calvin didn't smile, because freedom without purpose was just another kind of prison, and the foundation, Mary's last act of mercy, was now a casualty of his redemption. As they left the courthouse, cameras flashed like lightning. One reporter shouted, Dr. Whitaker, you lost everything. Was it worth it? Calvin paused on the steps, rain streaking down his face like tears too old to hide. Yes, he said, because she can rest now. Thomas placed a hand on his father's shoulder. We'll rebuild it. Her name, the foundation, all of it. Calvin nodded, but his eyes drifted toward the gray sky, as if searching for a voice in the thunder. And somewhere deep inside, he swore he heard her. Soft, certain, forgiving. The morning after the verdict, the town felt different, like someone had opened a window in a room no one realized was suffocating. The headlines were still merciless, but the comments had changed tone. Between the rage and the rumors, new voices began to thread through. My sister got clean at St. Elora. If Whitaker's program funded that, then maybe we're telling the story wrong. What if the wife wasn't a victim or a villain? What if she was exactly what he says, a guardian? Lydia North called before sunrise. You should come down to the community center, she said. A few people want to talk on the record. Survivors, nurses, family members. Her voice carried a surprise she tried to hide. They're asking for you. Thomas drove. Calvin watched the town glide past. The diner where Mary used to order pie. The narrow bookstore she loved. The church steps where she'd laughed the first time he tried to say something charming and only managed sincerity. He pressed his palm to the fogging glass and whispered her name, as if the syllables were a key. The community center was already overflowing. Folding chairs dragged in from storage, coffee and styrofoam cups, A cluster of local reporters with cameras small enough to feel intimate and unforgiving. A hand-lettered sign near the door read, "For Mary." Someone had taped a photocopy of her recital program beneath it. The edges curled like a smile that had been folded and unfolded 100 times. A woman in her 30s stepped up first, clutching a photo of a boy with shy eyes. "I'm Elena," she said, voice shaking but steadying with every word. "My brother relapsed 3 times. Mrs. Whitaker paid for his 4th try and sat with me in the waiting room. She didn't know us. She just stayed." She looked at Calvin, tears bright. "He's 3 years sober today." A murmur of applause rose, small but sincere. An older man with a union badge spoke next. "My boy worked maintenance at St. Elora. He said the program wasn't perfect, but there were people who gave a damn. Said Mary Whitaker was one of them. He came home one night and told me, 'Dad, sometimes saving someone looks like bending a rule so it doesn't break a person.'" Calvin felt Thomas's gaze on him. When he looked over, his son's eyes were wet in a way that didn't beg for denial or proof, just presence. Then the microphone reached the back row. A nurse stood, hair tugged into a bun, ID badge clipped to her cardigan. "Name's Marla Jensen," she said. "I worked nights on the 6th floor the week Mary died." The room stilled. "I read the papers saying she was a fool. She wasn't. She was the bravest person I've seen in 20 years. Told me, 'If the price of mercy is my name, then I'll pay it.' I wanted the world to hear that. Consider this my notice." Lydia caught Calvin's eye. A question there. "Ready?" He nodded, stepped forward, and took the microphone. Every neck tilted. The camera lights seemed gentler today, as if they'd learned manners. "I can't give you back the years I spent silent," he said, voice even. "But I can spend what I have left telling you what Mary taught me. That the opposite of shame isn't pride, it's service. If you want to defend her, don't trend her. Help someone. Sit with them. Stay." A hand shot up. A young podcaster Calvin had seen last night on a viral clip, face framed by big headphones and bigger opinions. "Dr. Whitaker, you're trending for all the reasons people usually cancel a man. If you could talk to them, what would you say?" Calvin smiled, almost. "I'd say, you're right to be angry. Institutions fail. Men fail. I did. But my wife used that failure as a blueprint for mercy. If you can't forgive me, forgive that idea." Applause. Louder now, uncoordinated and honest. Afterward, they spilled into the parking lot. A local TV producer pushed through the crowd, breathless. "Dr. Whitaker, Town Line tonight wants you live. National segment. They'll fly you out tonight." Pierce, who had slipped in at some point, sleeves rolled, tie loosened, frowned. "Careful. They don't schedule you to heal you. They schedule you to spike ratings." Thomas looked at his father. "We can say no." Calvin watched a boy skate past on a cracked sidewalk, hoodie flapping like a flag. He thought of the foundation, frozen, of Mary's name, thawing. "I won't let them turn her into entertainment," he said. "But if there's a chance to turn noise into help?" Lydia's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, eyes narrowing. "And right on cue," she muttered. "Carson just posted a thread accusing you of weaponizing grief. He says the foundation funds were diverted to personal media coaching." Thomas swore. "That's a lie," Lydia nodded. "Of course it is. But lies travel fast." She pocketed the phone. "So we run faster," Calvin exhaled. "We don't run. We build." He turned to the small sea of faces and raised his voice. "I'm hosting an open forum this Friday at the church hall. Not press, not spin, stories. If Mary ever touched your life, tell it. If the Mercy program helped or harmed you, say so. We'll write every name on a wall and call it what it should have been from the start. Accountability. A teenager near the door lifted his hand. Can we stream it? Thomas grinned through the ache. We can. As the crowd began to disperse, a man detached from the shadows near the edge of the lot. Narrow shoulders, baseball cap, a camera bag hanging from his side. He approached slowly, palms open. Dr. Whitaker, he said. Name's Noah Pike. I shot the family video, the one that leaked. I took a quick payday and ran. I'm not proud of it. He swallowed. But I have something you'll want to see. Footage from the hospital loading dock, March 9th, 2016. Morton and Carson, a box, a label that says Trial Records. They didn't move it into archives. Calvin's heart thudded once, hard, like a knock on a locked door. Where did they move it? Thomas asked. Noah glanced over his shoulder, as if the past could still follow. A storage unit outside Newport, under Carson's cousin's name. Lydia's eyes flashed. If that's true, it's the spine of the story. Calvin felt the old fear dawn, not for himself, but for the truth finally within reach. Show me, he said. Because microphones were good at catching sound, but some truths needed a key, a flashlight, and a door that had been waiting years to open. The storage unit was 30 miles north of Newport, a forgotten row of rust-colored doors behind an abandoned gas station. Rain slicked the asphalt, turning every reflection into a ghost. Noah Pike waited in his car, tapping the steering wheel nervously as Calvin, Thomas, and Lydia pulled up. Unit 37, he said, nodding toward the middle row. That's the one Carson rented under his cousin's name. He stopped paying 3 months ago. After that, the company planned to auction it. You've got about a week before it's gone. Lydia adjusted her raincoat, eyes sharp. You're sure no one else has been here? Noah hesitated. 2 nights ago, someone cut the padlock, then replaced it with a new one. Thomas swore. He's cleaning house. Calvin said nothing. He was staring at the door, faded blue, number 37 stenciled in peeling paint. The lock gleamed too new for its surroundings, a cold eye watching them. Pierce had arranged a local magistrate's warrant that morning. Lydia handed it to the attendant, who opened the unit with a groan of hinges and guilt. Inside, a stack of plastic bins labeled Archive, a rolling file cabinet, and the smell of mildew. Dust floated like regret in the flashlight beam. Lydia crouched beside the cabinet and tugged a drawer open. Trial documents, patient forms. She flipped through. Everything's here except the consent folders. Which means they took exactly what could clear you, Thomas said. Noah pointed toward the back. There's something under the tarp. Calvin knelt, pulling it away. Beneath lay a small wooden crate, sealed with wax tape and marked, Personal Dr. M. Whitaker. His chest tightened. Mary, he whispered. The crate contained cassette tapes, old dictaphone recordings labeled with her neat handwriting, patient notes, March 16. But the last one had a different title scrawled across it in blue ink. The Real Trial. Lydia's breath caught. She recorded them. Thomas frowned. What do you mean? Mary was meticulous, Lydia said. If she suspected corruption, she documented everything. They played the tape in Noah's car, static at first. Then Mary's voice, clear, trembling, alive. Day 3. Morton thinks I don't know he's falsifying dosages. Carson switched vials this morning. He says it's for consistency, but the numbers don't match. Daniel's vitals are stable. I'm next in line. If anything happens, tell Calvin. I did this for truth, not mercy." The tape clicked off. Lydia sat back, stunned. "That's enough to bury Carson and Morton's entire defense." Thomas's voice broke. She knew they were lying. She knew she might. Calvin stared out at the rain, hearing her voice loop through his memory. He wasn't sure whether to feel proud or destroyed. "We take it public," Lydia said. "Tonight, Town Line. Tonight still wants you on air. If we play that clip, it ends the debate." Pierce's warning echoed in his mind. They don't schedule you to heal you. But this wasn't about him anymore. It was about letting her speak one more time. That evening, they entered the downtown studio. Bright lights, cold coffee, a producer counting down from 10. Calvin sat opposite Vanessa Cole, a talk show host known for dissecting scandals like autopsies. "Dr. Whitaker," she began, voice silky, surgical. "The world's seen your confession. They've heard the accusations. But what we haven't heard, until now, is your wife's own voice." Calvin nodded slowly. Because until today, no one let her finish her sentence. He placed the cassette recorder on the table. The host gestured to the sound technician. "Play it." Mary's voice filled the studio, fragile yet unwavering. "If anyone's listening, please know mercy is never a crime, even when men make it one." Silence stretched, the kind that hums with electricity. The host blinked twice, momentarily human. When the broadcast ended, social media exploded. Mary Whitaker trended first. Then, "Mercy is not a crime." Viewers clipped her voice, remixed it with candlelit tributes and trembling piano covers. For the first time, Calvin didn't see his name in the headlines, only hers. But victory had a half-life. The next morning, Lydia burst into the motel room, laptop under her arm. "They're spinning it," she said. "Carson's lawyers filed a countersuit. They claim the tape is fabricated, deep-faked. They want you charged for digital tampering." Thomas slammed his coffee onto the table. "They're insane." Lydia nodded grimly. "Maybe, but they've just bought the silence of every outlet but one, the National Herald. I still have an editor there who'll run the full story. But you need to speak on the record. Live, raw, no lawyers." Calvin rubbed his eyes. "And what happens when the truth isn't enough?" Lydia's expression softened. "Then we remind them it's not truth we're selling. It's faith. In her, in mercy and what she died for." He looked at Thomas, at the boy who'd once called him a murderer and now stood ready to fight beside him. "Then let's remind them," Calvin said quietly. Outside, the sunrise broke through storm clouds, pale gold cutting across the soaked asphalt. For the first time in years, the light didn't hurt. The studio lights were merciless. They always were. Bright enough to expose pores, fears, and every flicker of doubt hiding beneath the surface. But Calvin wasn't afraid anymore. The National Herald had transformed its Sunday segment into a live special. Mercy and Betrayal, the Whitaker case, the final word. Every network in the country was tuned in. Carson had agreed to appear remotely, flanked by his legal team, his smirk confident and sterile through the screen. Across from him sat Calvin, jacket modest, voice uncoached, hands clasped as if in prayer. Lydia stood off camera, headset on, eyes locked on the teleprompter that Calvin had refused to use. Thomas sat in the front row of the live audience, his mother's locket glinting under the stage light. The host, Vanessa Cole, returned, sharper this time. "Dr. Whitaker, Dr. Carson, America's divided. Half believe your wife was a martyr. Half believes she was a manipulated test subject. Tonight, we settle this. Dr. Carson, you first. Carson adjusted his tie. The evidence against Dr. Whitaker remains circumstantial. The recordings, the letters, even the so-called confession, they were curated to distort. My colleagues and I maintain that Mary Whitaker's actions, though tragic, were her own. Calvin leaned forward slightly. Curated? You mean documented? By your own partner, Morton, the man you worked beside while you replaced her samples and falsified records. Carson's smile didn't falter. Big accusations for a man who's admitted guilt himself. Guilt, yes, Calvin said, his tone even, but not deceit. You stole that from her. The host glanced between them. Dr. Carson, you've claimed the newly released tapes were digitally fabricated. Do you have proof? Indeed, Carson said. Our forensic team analyzed the metadata. The file's timestamp shows modification, years after Mary Whitaker's death. The audience murmured. Vanessa turned to Calvin. Your response? Calvin looked straight into the camera, not at the host, not at Carson, but at the millions of strangers waiting to decide who they believed. Metadata changes every time a file is transferred, he said. When my son and I opened that tape, it was copied to a digital drive. That's your modification. But what you can't modify, Doctor, is her voice. He reached into his coat and produced the original cassette, still labeled in Mary's handwriting. We brought the tape itself, analog, dated, sealed, and authenticated this morning by the Herald's technicians. Lydia gave a subtle nod from the wings. The host gestured to the sound crew. Play it. The hiss of static filled the room. Then Mary's voice, weary but unwavering. If anyone hears this, it means they turned my mercy into a weapon. Morton and Carson threatened Calvin's license, said if I didn't sign, they'd ruin him. I chose the risk. I chose the trial. Not for science, for love. A pin could have fallen and thundered. Carson's face on the monitor paled slightly, the edges of his composure fraying. That could have been doctored. Vanessa cut him off. We just confirmed the analog tape matches the 2016 audio frequency signature. That's her. Live. Unaltered. The audience broke into spontaneous applause. Lydia lowered her headset, smiling for the first time in weeks. Thomas's hands shook as he clapped. Slow at first, then with conviction. Calvin closed his eyes briefly, hearing her voice as if she were in the room. When he opened them, he looked at Carson. You said she was naive, but she was the only one of us brave enough to be honest. Carson leaned forward, voice cracking under the weight of panic. You don't know what you're doing. That trial, those compounds, they were... Vanessa raised her hand. Dr. Carson, are you admitting the Mercy protocol was falsified? He froze. The cameras zoomed in. Silence squeezed the air from the room. And then, the fatal slip. We did what we had to. Morton said the data would ruin us if it came out. The host's eyes widened. Thank you, Doctor. That's all we needed. The control room erupted. Technicians shouted. Producers scrambled. But Calvin sat still, calm, like a man finally stepping out of a storm that had lasted nearly a decade. When the broadcast ended, the clip went viral within minutes. Carson's confession, Mary's voice, the final proof. By midnight, government agencies announced a full investigation into St. Elora's research division. Carson resigned within hours. But the real victory came not in headlines, but in messages. Thousands of them. Survivors, students, mothers, strangers. My husband died waiting for mercy. Your wife gave it to him. I forgave my father tonight. Thank you. Mary Whitaker taught me that love can still mean truth. Thomas sat beside his father on the motel balcony that night, their faces lit by the faint glow of Calvin's phone. The rain had stopped. The world had gone quiet. She did it, Thomas said softly. She really did it. Calvin smiled, tired but whole. No, son, we did, by finally letting her speak. He looked up at the bruised horizon, where dawn was beginning to peel away the dark. And in that silence between night and morning, it almost felt like she was there. The echo of her piano, the warmth of her laugh, the mercy she left behind. 6 months later, the marble halls of the federal courthouse in Washington echoed with footsteps that carried years of ghosts. This wasn't just another hearing. It was the case. The State versus St. Elora Medical Consortium. The government had finally moved, compelled by public outrage and the viral footage that tore open the truth. Calvin Whitaker had been summoned, not as the accused this time, but as the key witness. When he entered the courtroom, reporters leaned forward, pens poised like daggers. Thomas followed behind him, calm, steady, no longer a son haunted by doubt, but an anchor keeping his father upright. Across the aisle, Dr. Lyle Carson sat flanked by his lawyers, eyes sunken, hands twitching as though the ghosts of every lie he'd told were tightening invisible cuffs around his wrists. The charges against him read like a manifesto of corruption. Fraud, falsified research, coercion, and the unlawful manipulation of human trials. Judge Morales, a woman with the kind of composure that could freeze a riot, presided from the bench. Her gaze swept the room. Let's begin. The prosecutor, a young, sharp-eyed attorney named Maya Lynn, stood. Your Honor, the state calls Dr. Calvin Whitaker. Calvin took the stand. The weight of the oath in his hand felt heavier than ever before, not because he feared perjury, but because truth finally had a pulse again. Maya approached gently. Dr. Whitaker, for the record, did you design the chemical compound used in what has come to be known as the Mercy Protocol? Yes, Calvin said. His voice was calm, low. But not for profit. It was meant to help those who couldn't respond to conventional treatment. The testing was supposed to be voluntary, monitored, and safe. Maya nodded. And was it? No, he said, because they changed it. Morton and Carson altered the formula, cut costs, ignored dosages, fabricated success rates. I discovered inconsistencies and tried to stop it. But by then, my wife had already learned more than I realized. He paused. The courtroom was silent except for the faint scratching of pens. She joined the program, he continued. Not to save the research, but to save me. Carson threatened to expose my early involvement, claimed I approved unverified data. If that came out, it would have ended my career and everything we'd built. She volunteered to take the treatment, thinking she could shield me from the fallout. Instead, it killed her. Maya nodded solemnly. And the evidence of that choice, it was concealed? Yes. Carson hid the real trial records. Morton destroyed the consent logs. When the investigation began, they painted her as reckless, unstable, a desperate woman. But the truth was simpler. She was brave. Calvin's gaze flicked to Carson. Braver than any of us. Carson's lawyer rose for cross-examination, tall and slick, the kind of man who smiled only to sharpen his teeth. Dr. Whitaker, he began, you've confessed to aiding unapproved research, falsifying data, and misleading authorities. Isn't it convenient that all the men who could contradict you are either dead or disgraced? Calvin met his stare evenly. Convenient? No, it's devastating. The lawyer smirked. And your so-called proof? A cassette tape found in a warehouse? For all we know, you could have planted it yourself. Calvin leaned forward, his tone measured but cutting. If you believe that, play it again, and this time listen like a human being. The lawyer hesitated, then nodded to the clerk. The tape played, Mary's voice trembling but unbroken. If anyone hears this, please know mercy is never a crime. The room froze. Even Carson's defense team couldn't hide their discomfort. The judge herself leaned back, eyes narrowing at the playback. When the tape ended, Calvin said softly, I didn't plant that. I lived it. The prosecutor rose again. Your Honor, the defense can challenge authenticity, but the state has obtained metadata verification from the Herald's archives, confirming the file predates 2016. Combined with the recovered hospital documents, it's irrefutable. The judge nodded. So entered. Carson's lawyer sat down slowly, his confidence draining. Carson's hands shook as he whispered something frantic into his ear. Calvin looked at him, not with anger anymore, but with the quiet pity of someone who's already buried too many regrets. I used to believe mercy was weakness, Calvin said suddenly, voice steady but thick. That the law had to be perfect, that people didn't. My wife taught me otherwise. Maya Lin turned to the bench. No further questions, Your Honor. As Calvin stepped down from the stand, he caught Thomas's gaze, a small, almost imperceptible nod between two men who'd finally made peace with the truth. Judge Morales struck her gavel lightly. We'll reconvene after recess. Dr. Carson will take the stand next. Outside, the storm clouds rolled in, heavy, silver-edged, electric. But for Calvin Whitaker, it no longer looked like weather. It looked like closure. When the court resumed after recess, the air felt heavier, charged, expectant. The public benches were full, the aisles crowded with cameras and restless curiosity. Everyone knew the next testimony would decide not just Carson's fate, but Mary's legacy. Judge Morales adjusted her glasses. The court will now hear from Dr. Lyle Carson. He rose slowly, every step a performance of reluctant dignity. His suit was perfect, but his eyes were wild, cornered animal wild. He placed a hand on the rail as if to steady himself before the storm. The prosecutor, Maya Lin, wasted no time. Dr. Carson, you were the financial and operational lead of the Mercy Protocol project, correct? Yes, he said, voice dry. Under the authority of the board and with oversight from Dr. Morton. And you maintained access to all research data, including dosage schedules and patient consent forms. Yes. Maya paced, letting her heels click against the marble, deliberate, precise. Tell the court then. Where are those forms now? Carson shifted. Destroyed during the department merger. Destroyed, Maya repeated, her tone razor thin. And who authorized that destruction? He hesitated. Morton. Morton was dead by then. Carson's jaw flexed. Then I did. But it was routine, outdated materials. Maya stepped closer. Outdated? The signatures of human test subjects? The last records of a woman who died in that very trial? Carson didn't answer. His fingers dug into the wooden rail. Maya pressed on. Dr. Carson, you told investigators the tapes released by Dr. Whitaker were fabricated. You even filed a counterclaim alleging fraud. Would you like to repeat that under oath? He began, then stopped. His lawyer leaned forward, whispering urgently. Carson shook his head, sweat glistening at his temple. I was mistaken. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Morales struck her gavel. Order! Maya's tone softened, almost merciful. Dr. Carson, this is your moment. Tell the truth, for once. He swallowed. Morton and we falsified outcomes. We promised investors a breakthrough, but the compound wasn't stable. Mary found out. She threatened to expose us, so we told her we'd ruin Calvin instead. She said she wouldn't let that happen. His voice broke. She volunteered herself. Thomas's breath hitched. Calvin closed his eyes. Even the court reporter hesitated, her keys pausing mid-word. She thought she could survive one dose, Carson said, but she didn't. When she died, Morton panicked. We erased her logs. We blamed her condition. I wanted to come forward, but... His words trailed into a whisper. But I liked my life too much. The silence that followed was absolute. No one breathed. Then, from the back of the courtroom, a voice spoke. That's not all he did. Heads turned. A woman in nurse's scrubs was walking down the aisle, escorted by a bailiff. Older now, but unmistakable. Nurse Delaney. Judge Morales frowned. You are? Patricia Delaney, Your Honor. I was a senior nurse at St. Alora's in 2016. I've come forward with new records. She held up a sealed folder. Filed under my ID, not destroyed, because I couldn't live with that lie. The bailiff handed the folder to the judge, who passed it to the clerk. Pages rustled, gasps rippled. Maya stepped closer. Ms. Delaney, what do those records contain? Original consent forms, she said. Mary Whitaker's handwriting, verified by me. They show she signed herself in under M. Hale, but with a note in the margin. What note? Delaney's voice trembled. Do not blame Calvin. He didn't know. Tell him I forgive him. Thomas's hand flew to his mouth. Calvin bowed his head, eyes burning. Maya turned back to the witness stand. Dr. Carson, you claim the files were destroyed. How do you explain their existence? Carson was shaking now, color draining from his face. I don't... She must have kept copies. Delaney cut in, voice steady now. She did. Because she said one day, someone would need proof that love can be brave and still be right. Judge Morales leaned forward. Dr. Carson, based on your admission and corroborating evidence, do you deny your role in falsifying the research? Carson looked around, at the cameras, the crowd, at Calvin watching him not with hatred, but sorrow. No, he said finally. I don't deny it. The gavel struck. The defendant is remanded into custody pending sentencing. Reporters surged to their feet. Shutters clicked like applause for a truth too long withheld. As guards led Carson away, he turned toward Calvin. She loved you more than she feared us, he said hoarsely. You know that, right? Calvin nodded. I do, and I'll spend what's left of me proving she was right to. Delaney walked past him, eyes glassy but proud. She'd be smiling today, she whispered. Outside, the sky cracked open, sunlight slicing through the gray. The crowd erupted as Calvin stepped out of the courthouse, not as a man accused, but as a man finally absolved. And in the noise, for the first time in nearly a decade, the world said her name, not with pity, but with reverence. Mary Whitaker. When the court reconvened for the final verdict, the air carried an almost sacred stillness, the kind that comes after years of noise. Every seat was filled. The press had stopped whispering. Even the judge's gavel, when it fell, seemed gentler this time, like a benediction rather than a weapon. After review of evidence, testimony, and recovered documents, Judge Morales began, her voice solemn but steady. This court finds Dr. Lyle Carson guilty on all counts, including falsification of clinical records, coercion, and obstruction of justice. The court further recognizes the late Mary Whitaker as a victim of coercion and misconduct, and as a voluntary witness to truth. Her name will be cleared of all prior allegations. For a moment, no one moved. Then, the courtroom erupted. Applause, sobs, relief, the collective exhale of a decade's worth of grief. Calvin sat frozen, his hands pressed together as if in prayer. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He simply looked upward, as if some part of him believed Mary could see the light cutting through the high courthouse windows. Thomas's hand found his shoulder. "Dad, they said her name right this time." Calvin nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "And they'll never take it back again." Judge Morales continued. "Before we close this hearing, the court grants Dr. Whitaker the right to a final statement for the record." Calvin rose slowly, the sound of the room dimming beneath the weight of his footsteps. When he reached the stand, he didn't bring notes. He didn't need any. "I came here today," he began, "not to win, not to prove I was innocent, but to tell you that justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't sound like victory. It sounds like silence. Because truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to survive long enough to be heard." He looked toward the gallery, where Lydia, Nurse Delaney, and Pierce sat side by side, their faces reflecting exhaustion and grace. "My wife's name," Calvin said, voice trembling, "was dragged through headlines, through rumor, through every kind of cruelty we can invent when we're afraid of the truth. But she never stopped believing mercy was worth dying for. And maybe she was right. Because mercy, real mercy, doesn't pick sides. It doesn't punish to cleanse. It forgives to rebuild." He turned to the judge. "You asked me earlier what I learned from all this. The answer is simple. You can spend your whole life saving lives, but the hardest one you'll ever save is your own. And you can't do it without forgiveness." His gaze drifted to the empty space beside him, the one that had always felt occupied. "Mary taught me that." The judge's expression softened. "Thank you, Dr. Whitaker. The record will reflect your statement." When the gavel came down one final time, it didn't sound like an ending. It sounded like the closing of a wound. Outside, the courthouse steps were flooded with cameras, flowers, and faces, strangers who'd come not for scandal, but to bear witness. A reporter called out, "Dr. Whitaker, now that Mary's name has been cleared, what's next for you?" He smiled faintly. "To live the way she did, by helping others find mercy where the world tells them none exists." The crowd parted as a breeze rolled through, scattering petals from the bouquets piled along the rails. Someone began to hum, a tune faint, familiar. Mary's piano melody. Within seconds, the crowd joined softly, the hum swelling into a hymn that felt older than grief itself. Calvin stood still, eyes closed. He imagined her beside him, just as she'd been in that hospital room years ago. Her hand warm against his, her voice a whisper. "Promise me, Calvin. If you can't forgive me, at least forgive yourself." "I do," he murmured aloud, to the sky, to the light, to her. Thomas stepped closer. "Dad, what now?" Calvin looked at him, the son who had once condemned him, now his truest ally. "Now," he said, "we start again, for her." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the deed papers he'd filed quietly 2 weeks before. The transfer of Mary's Hope Foundation back into operation, funded by community donations and survivor grants. "It won't carry my name," he said softly. "Only hers." Thomas smiled through tears. She'd like that. As father and son descended the courthouse steps, the setting sun bathed the marble in gold, the same color as the piano Mary used to play, the same light she'd once chased across the living room floor. Calvin paused halfway down, turned back to face the sea of faces, microphones, and cameras, and spoke one final time. "Justice didn't bring me peace. Forgiveness did. And if you remember anything about Mary Whitaker, remember this. She didn't die fighting corruption. She died proving that love and truth can live in the same room." The applause came soft, then thunderous, and as the last light of evening slipped across his face, Calvin finally let go of the burden he'd carried all those years, not by forgetting her, but by understanding her. She hadn't just saved his name, she had saved his soul. The morning after the verdict, the world didn't roar. It simmered. Headlines lost their exclamation points and grew teeth. Carson guilty, mercy, protocol, fraud confirmed. Federal sanctions hammer St. Elora, board members resign in waves. Mary Whitaker officially exonerated, foundation to reopen. For once, Calvin read every word. He didn't flinch when the articles retold the ugliest parts. Ugliness was finally attached to the right names. Carson's fall was not cinematic. It was administrative, the kind of collapse that takes place in fluorescent rooms with too much air conditioning and not enough dignity. Cameras captured him being led from a side entrance in handcuffs, chin tucked, hair damp with sweat. The sentence wouldn't come for weeks, but the sentence the world cared about arrived instantly. Colleagues turned their faces away. The university scrubbed his faculty page. Donors issued brittle statements about misplaced trust and a failure of oversight. Morton's legacy fared worse. His old lecture videos disappeared behind private locks. A scholarship in his name was paused for reassessment. Former protégés issued rehearsed apologies that never said the only words that mattered. "We knew." The medical journals that had once published his glowing preliminary data now appended retractions in precise, cold language. The red stamps looked like fruitless attempts at penance. St. Elora itself became a public warning label. Federal inspectors marched through its corridors, box after box of records loaded onto carts, like the clinic was coughing up everything it had swallowed. The hospital's communications officer smiled into microphones and called it a necessary audit, but the smile looked stapled on. Patients lined up at the front desk demanding transfers. 3 class action suits formed overnight. A local pastor stood on the lawn and prayed, not for the hospital, but for the families who'd believed it. There was a cost to lies, and for once, the invoice was addressed correctly. Calvin didn't watch the coverage at home. He watched it from a folding chair in the church hall, where volunteers peeled tape from poster boards that read, "Mary's Hope, Reopening Intake." The room smelled like coffee and determination. Thomas and Lydia argued over where to hang the banner, while Nurse Delaney labeled clipboards with tidy block letters that steadied everyone else's hands. "People will come angry," Delaney warned softly. "Let them. Anger's just grief that hasn't been listened to yet." Calvin nodded. He had learned to hear anger differently now, not as a verdict, but as evidence. By noon, they opened the doors. The line moved quietly, like a procession without a casket. First came a woman from 3 towns over, knuckles white around a manila folder stuffed with bills. My son needs treatment, she said. The good kind, the honest kind. Calvin took the folder like it was a baby. We'll find it, he promised. Next, a man in a mechanic's uniform with grease on his collar. I don't want money, he said. I want someone to tell me I didn't fail my wife by believing in that hospital. Calvin looked him in the eyes and told him the truth he'd wished someone had given him years earlier. Belief isn't failure. Betrayal is. A teenager arrived alone, hoodie up, eyes red from a night that hadn't ended. He slid a Ziploc bag across the table. Inside, a bottle of pills he'd decided not to take. I heard your wife, he muttered. That tape. Calvin's throat tightened. He handed the kid a card and a seat and a cup of tea he didn't know he knew how to pour. Satisfaction, the kind that the internet calls justice served, didn't land like a cheer. It landed like a breath finally taken. But there were moments of sharp, human ha-hey all the same. On the 5th day, a former board member shuffled in, hat in hand, voice paper-cut thin. I signed the oversight letters, he said. I looked away. Thomas didn't raise his voice. He slid a donation form across the table. The man read the header. In memory of Mary Whitaker. That's what the donation form read. The old board member's signature trembled, ink bleeding through the paper like confession. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't need to. Signing the name was apology enough. By the end of the first month, Mary's Hope Foundation had transformed from a symbol into a heartbeat. The hall buzzed with volunteers, former nurses, students, single mothers, addicts in recovery. Even a few doctors who'd once walked out on Calvin now returned in quiet humility. Every morning began with the same ritual. They played a short recording of Mary's voice, that single sentence she left behind. Mercy is never a crime. It echoed through the hall, fragile and steady, reminding them that redemption wasn't a headline. It was work. The government issued an official apology, a dry press release about procedural failures. Calvin didn't read it. But one morning, a courier arrived with a small package from the Department of Health. Inside lay a bronze plaque, engraved with the words, "In honor of Dr. Mary Whitaker, whose courage redefined compassion." Calvin didn't mount it on a wall. He placed it at the front desk where patients could touch it as they checked in. She worked with her hands, he told Thomas. She'd want to keep doing it. The world moved on in its own crooked rhythm. Carson's trial made one last cycle through the news. 20 years in federal prison, stripped license, restitution order. Morton's estate faced liquidation. St. Alora's building was shuttered, sold to a rehabilitation nonprofit that applied to rename it the Whitaker Center for Restorative Care. When the sign went up, reporters tried to pull a statement from Calvin. He simply said, "Good. Let the same walls hear better stories." Lydia published her final piece for the Herald, not a scandal exposé, but an elegy titled "The Sound of Mercy." It traced Mary's voice through every life she'd touched, every policy she'd changed, every person who'd decided not to die because she once decided to risk it all. The article went viral for all the right reasons. Not outrage, not pity, but awe. Thomas read it aloud in the kitchen one night. "She'd like this," he said softly. She'd say, "Finally, they wrote it like a song, not a trial." Calvin smiled, eyes misty. She always said truth should sing. The seasons turned. By the first anniversary of the verdict, Mary's Hope had helped over 200 families rebuild. They hosted counseling sessions, job programs, grief circles where people read their own letters to the dead and left them in glass jars marked for tomorrow. One evening, as the volunteers packed up, Calvin found a young nurse sitting at the piano Mary used to play in the hall. She looked up shyly. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "they told me this was her favorite piece." Her fingers hovered, uncertain. He nodded. "Go ahead." The melody started soft, hesitant at first, then sure, warm, alive. The same tune that once filled their home now filled a room full of strangers and survivors. Calvin closed his eyes, letting it carry him, not back into grief, but forward into grace. When the last note faded, he whispered, "That's her." The nurse smiled. She'd be proud. Later that night, Calvin walked home alone. The town was quiet. He passed the old church where he and Mary had first met, the hospital gate where she'd said her final goodbye, the bench where Thomas once accused him of murder. Everything looked smaller now, gentler. Time had sanded down the edges. At home, he poured a cup of tea and sat by the window. Rain began to fall, soft, cleansing, familiar. He reached for the worn notebook Mary used to keep beside the piano, the one full of half-written lullabies and phrases that read like prayers. One line stood out, faint but legible. "If love survives long enough to forgive, then nothing was wasted." He picked up his pen and added beneath it, in his own careful handwriting, "I forgive us both." The next morning, Calvin stood before a small crowd at the Foundation's first annual memorial event. Behind him, a banner fluttered in the spring wind. Mary's Hope, 1 year of light. He didn't give a speech. He told a story. About the doctor who thought truth lived in textbooks until his wife taught him it lived in choices. About the patient who came seeking help but found faith instead. About a woman who turned her death into a doorway for others to live. And when he finished, he said the only line that mattered. Mercy saved her. And now, it saves us. The crowd rose, clapping softly, not the applause of spectacle but of solidarity. Thomas stepped up beside him, carrying a small wooden box. Together, they opened it and released a handful of white rose petals into the wind. The petals spiraled upward, caught in sunlight, carried by something invisible yet undeniable. For a moment, everyone looked up, and it was as if Mary herself had been among them, smiling through the light. That evening, as the last volunteers locked the doors, Calvin lingered by the piano once more. The hall was empty, golden with sunset. He traced his fingers over the keys and whispered, "We did it, Mary. You're home again." Outside, the sign above the door gleamed in the fading light. Mary's Hope Foundation, where mercy begins again. And in the soft hush of dusk, Calvin finally felt what he'd chased through all the trials, the headlines, the sleepless nights. Not triumph, not vindication. Peace. Prison remade the clock. Hours weren't hours. They were water, dripping, pooling, growing loud enough to gnaw through sleep. In cell B12, Lyle Carson learned that regret has a sound, and it was the soft slap of his state-issue slippers on concrete at 3:17 a.m., the scrape of a tray, the click of a lock, the hiss of fluorescent lights that believed in nothing but staying awake. The first night he dreamed of a room without corners. Morton was there, younger, alive, sleeves rolled, grinning like a coach at halftime. "You'll thank me for this," Morton said, as if falsifying a dosage were a gift. When Carson reached for the clipboard, it became Mary's hand instead. Warm, steady, unflinching. He woke, biting back a shout that arrived as a whisper. The man on the lower bunk, Rivera, an older inmate with Bible pages for bookmarks, didn't look up. He'd heard worse confessions in the dark. Days inched. They gave him a job in the infirmary, where the smell of antiseptic braided itself with the metallic breath of the vents. He wrapped gauze around knuckles that had learned to speak before the mouth. He checked blood pressure for men whose hearts pounded like locked doors. No white coat, no title. Just a name on a stitched tag, Carson, and a nurse who watched him work the way you watch a man crossing thawed ice. "Used to be a doctor?" she asked once, voice flat. "No," he said, because what he had been didn't fit here. "I used to be someone who knew how to stop bleeding." She nodded and passed him a roll of tape. "Try starting there." At Chow, the TV in the corner hissed through a talk show rerun, a clip of Mary's voice. "Mercy is never a crime." And then a panel arguing whether mercy needed boundaries. Laughter, a commercial for cough drops. Carson watched the fluorescent reflection of himself in the screen and hated how ordinary he looked. How small. That was the worst part. How easily the world looked away from him now. He had built a career on being impossible to ignore. Consequence taught him anonymity. The letters started on day 19. The first 3 were threats. The fourth, an elegy from a mother whose son had died at St. Elora. "You and your friend made hope sound like a product. I lit a candle for him and one for you. Mercy doesn't skip the guilty." Carson folded that one carefully and put it under his pillow like a relic he didn't deserve. At night, regret rearranged his memories. He could no longer recall Morton's arguments without also hearing the rustle of Mary's consent form. He couldn't think about money without tasting copper, the aftertaste of an ethical hemorrhage. He'd convinced himself for years that outcomes mattered more than rules, that bending data toward a cure was a lesser sin than watching people drown in compliant paperwork. In the quiet, a simpler sentence rose up and asked to be heard. You were afraid. Afraid of failure, of losing grants, of hearing the word no spoken by a truth you couldn't edit. On the 33rd night, he wrote to Calvin. He expected the paper to resist him. It didn't. It soaked up each word like cotton takes blood, without flinching, without judgment. Dr. Whitaker, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't think I get to ask for anything. This is a record, a better one than what I kept. Morton used to say, data tells the story you want if you ask it the right way. Mary told a different story, the kind where truth doesn't care if it ruins you. I thought I was protecting the work. I was protecting myself. I realize now the program became a mirror, and I chose to blind it. You were right about me. Not in the words you said in court, those were too gentle, but in the way you looked at me. Pity is a verdict, too. The night before she died, Mary cornered me in the hallway outside the recovery ward. She said, "If you hurt him with a lie, I'll tell the truth loud enough to break your life." I told myself it was grief speaking. It was courage. I signed the destruction order. I switched the vials. I moved the box to storage. That is my ledger. There's one thing I can give you that I never gave anyone. A name. The supplier Morton used for the off-book compounds, Halverson Labs, Newark facility, Unit 6A. He wanted a cheaper vector. We tested it on rats, then on a man who loved his wife more than we feared her. And it broke all of us. If there's any justice I can participate in from here, it's this. Take what I hoarded. Use it to rebuild what I helped ruin. One more thing. I've learned there are 2 kinds of prayers in this place. The first asks for escape. The second asks to become someone who could live with the truth if it arrived. I'm trying to learn the second. If you write back, don't say you forgive me. Tell me what to fix. Lyle Rivera watched him seal the envelope, his old hands steady where Carson's shook. Gonna mail your ghost? Rivera asked. My confession, Carson said. Same thing, Rivera murmured, taking the envelope and sliding it through the slot during mail call. Only difference is whether you expect it to answer. The dreams changed after that. Not kinder, just clearer. He saw the storage unit, the wax tape on the crate, Mary's handwriting on a label that read, "The Real Trial." He woke one morning with a sentence lodged in his mouth like a shard. You made grief efficient. He wrote it down and taped it to the wall above the stainless steel sink. Each time he brushed his teeth, he read it until the words dulled enough to let him breathe. Weeks folded. The infirmary became the only place he didn't feel spectral. A young inmate came in with a panic attack so severe his hands clawed for air that wouldn't come. Carson crouched, counted breaths, anchored him with a voice that remembered how to be steady. When the boy finally inhaled without fracturing, he looked up through tear-salted lashes and said, "You a real doctor?" Carson almost lied. Then he shook his head. "No, but I'm trying to be a real man." The boy laughed, a scraped sound that still managed to be grateful. That counts more in here. On a rain-soaked Tuesday, the chaplain, a woman with a scar that made her smile look truer, stopped by his cell. "You've been quiet," she said, eyes flicking to the wall of taped lines. "I'm counting," he said. "What?" "Costs." She nodded once. "Balance sheets make poor Bibles. But if you're going to keep one, at least add this column, lives you repaired." He didn't answer. He didn't know how. That night, mail call brought an envelope with handwriting he recognized immediately. Calm, angular, disciplined. Calvin Whitaker. Carson sat on the bunk and stared at it for a long time before sliding a finger under the flap. The letter was 3 paragraphs. No sermons, no absolution. Just sentences that landed like splints. "Lyle, thank you for the name. I've forwarded it to the investigators and to the Foundation's counsel. If there's a way to turn your confession into care, we'll find it. You asked what to fix. Start with this. Every man who sits across from you in the infirmary, see him as the trial you were supposed to run correctly the first time. Do no harm. Tell the truth. Stay." Mary believed mercy could change men, prove her right in a place that doesn't expect it. Calvin Carson read the last line twice. He folded the letter and placed it beside the mother's elegy under the pillow. 2 pages that didn't cancel each other, only clarified the debt. Lights out swallowed the block. In the dark, he whispered to no one, to the hum, to the drip. "I'll stay." Outside, rain stitched the night back together. Inside, for the first time since the verdict, he slept without running. 6 months into his sentence, the rhythm of prison had changed for Lyle Carson. The clang of gates no longer startled him. The fluorescent lights didn't feel like interrogation anymore, just time passing. Every morning, he made his rounds in the infirmary, bandaging, logging, listening. Some of the men called him Doc. He didn't correct them. Others spat at him when they recognized the name from the news. He didn't argue with them either. Both reactions felt fair. But sometimes, a third thing happened. A quiet thank you whispered from a bunk when he changed a dressing without flinching. Those moments, rare and unceremonious, stitched together the edges of something that looked suspiciously like redemption. One afternoon, a fight broke out in the yard. 2 inmates dragged a bleeding man into the infirmary, shirt soaked, panic rising. The guards shouted for order. The nurse froze, trembling. Carson moved without thinking. "Pressure here," he barked, grabbing a towel. Get me saline now! The injured man wheezed. The cut across his abdomen was deep, too deep for the cheap antiseptic and the trembling hands of orderlies who didn't want to get involved. Carson knelt in the blood and found the artery by instinct, fingers remembering what his conscience had once erased. "Stay with me," he murmured. "You hear me? You're not dying in this room." The man's breath rattled, then steadied. It took 22 minutes and a mercy he didn't know he still had. After they'd carried the inmate to recovery, the nurse stood by the sink, shaking. "You saved him," she whispered. Carson looked down at his hands, crimson, trembling, human. "No," he said quietly. "He gave me a chance to try again." That night, he wrote another letter, not to Calvin this time, to Mary. "Mary, there's no address for you anymore, but I'm writing anyway. Today I did something good, not because it redeems what I did, but because it reminded me who I was supposed to be. You said once that mercy isn't about who deserves it. Maybe that includes me. I keep hearing your voice in that hallway, not the warning, but the forgiveness underneath it. You weren't angry that I lied. You were angry that I was afraid of the truth. You were right. If you can see this, if anything of us still echoes somewhere, tell Calvin that I'm doing what he asked. I stay. I tell the truth. I do no harm. And when I run out of days, I'll owe you one more. The one where I finally stop pretending I was ever the victim." Lyle. He folded the page and placed it inside a thin book of psalms the chaplain had given him. He didn't believe in holy words yet, but he believed in keeping promises. Months passed. Winter came. On the morning of his parole hearing, the guards found him already dressed, letter pressed against his chest. The nurse from the infirmary stood near the bars. "You nervous?" "No," he said. "Just unfinished." When they led him into the small room, the board asked the same questions every inmate hears: remorse, rehabilitation, intent. He answered simply, without defense or flair. "I can't undo the harm," he said, "but I can outlive the lie. That's the only work left." The board chair, an older woman with stern eyes, looked at him for a long moment. "You've served 6 years," she said. "If we grant release, what will you do outside?" He thought for a moment. "There's a foundation in Chicago, Mary's Hope. I don't expect them to let me through the door, but maybe they'll let me sweep the floor." When the guards escorted him back to his cell, Rivera grinned from his bunk. "So? They let you out?" "Not yet," Carson said, sitting. "But I think they heard me." That night, he couldn't sleep. He opened Calvin's letter again, the one about seeing every man as the trial you failed. He looked around the dim dormitory, men coughing, dreaming, surviving, and whispered, "Every one of you, every single one." He meant it. A week later, a small envelope arrived, stamped Mary's Hope Foundation. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a photograph. The note, in Calvin's careful hand, read, "Lyle, we received your confession. The labs have been seized, and the funds you mentioned are now redirected to the new recovery center. We named the program after her favorite phrase, Mercy Clinic. I can't offer absolution. That's not mine to give. But I can offer this, proof that something good grew from what you broke." Attached was a photograph, a sunlit room filled with patients and volunteers. On the far wall, a plaque read, "In honor of those who learned mercy the hard way." Carson stared at it for a long time. Then he smiled. Small, exhausted, but real. He turned to Rivera. "You ever think hell can turn into a classroom?" Rivera chuckled. only if you start paying attention. That night, Carson slipped Mary's letter, Calvin's note, and the photo into an envelope addressed to the chaplain's office. On the front, he wrote just 3 words, "For whoever needs." Then he walked to the window, pressed his palm to the cold glass, and whispered the only prayer he could remember that wasn't about himself. Mercy for the living, mercy for the dead. The moon hung like a pale coin above the razor wire, and for the first time, he didn't feel trapped beneath it. He felt accounted for. He went to sleep with the smallest peace a man can earn, not forgiveness, not freedom, but the quiet knowledge that at last he'd stopped running from the truth. They started west because the map said ocean, and Mary had always believed water knew how to carry grief without spilling it. Calvin and Thomas packed light, a duffel of clothes, a shoebox of letters from patients who'd written thank you in 100 different spellings, and the bronze plaque that used to sit at the foundation's front desk. Lydia insisted they take it. "Let people touch what saved them," she said. "Let the metal learn more names." The first stop was a storefront clinic in St. Louis, where the waiting room smelled of lemon cleaner and courage. The director, a woman with laugh lines deeper than her worry lines, met them at the door. "You don't know me," she said, "but your wife sat with my sister the night she almost left. She braided her hair so she wouldn't feel like a patient." The woman pointed to a corner wall. A small frame held 3 words on cheap cardstock: "Mercy is never a crime." Beneath it, a teen boy adjusted the sleeves on his work shirt and practiced a smile in the reflection. "First day," he said, catching Calvin's eye. "I'm training to be a peer counselor." Thomas bumped his fist, casual, brotherly. The boy's grin stuck. They drove south into Tennessee to a church basement-turned-recovery hub. Potluck casseroles steamed on fold-out tables, and a whiteboard listed the week's goals. Listen, tell the truth, sleep. An elderly man shuffled up in a veteran's jacket, eyes bright as a new coin. "She wrote me a letter," he said, tapping his chest. "Told me living wasn't penance. It was proof." He pulled a wrinkled page from his pocket and offered it to Calvin. The handwriting was Mary's. The date was 3 weeks before she died. Thomas put his hand on the man's shoulder and left it there longer than manners required. In Mississippi, a woman named Gwen led them through a community garden that used to be a vacant lot. "We plant what we can keep," she said, pressing a sprig of mint into Calvin's palm. "We give away what we can't. That's what your Mary taught me." She pointed toward a patch of roses, white and stubborn. "Those don't care who waters them," she added. "They bloom anyway. That's mercy." Thomas laughed softly, surprised by how right it felt to hear theology in dirt. By the time they reached Texas, the stories were drafting themselves. Lydia flew in for a weekend, holed up in a motel room with a stack of napkin notes and parking receipt quotes, shaping them into something the country could read without looking away. "We don't name villains anymore," she said, tapping the space bar. "We name repairs." One night near El Paso, they stopped at a thrift store that doubled as a meeting space after hours. The fluorescent lights buzzed like careful bees. A small crowd waited, half curious, half reverent. A woman at the back raised her hand. "I don't have a story about your wife," she said. "I have a story about your son." Thomas blinked. "Me?" "You answered my email at 2 a.m., she said. "You didn't tell me to be strong. You told me where to go in the morning and what to ask for. My brother's alive because you remembered there are hours after midnight." Thomas looked down, swallowed hard. It turns out Mercy had his handwriting, too. The road bent north, toward Chicago. The city air felt heavier, not cruel, just crowded with all the breath people hold when they're trying not to break. The Mary's Hope, Mercy Clinic, shared a brick wall with a bakery and a boxing gym that let kids punch at the air until the ghosts got bored. Inside, a bulletin board bloomed with Polaroids. First paychecks, reunions, cake smears on cheeks, 2 hands signing the lease on a studio apartment with sunlit hardwood floors. They were waiting for Calvin. Not a speech, a circle. "Tell us something she taught you that isn't in any newspaper," the facilitator said. Calvin thought of 100 things. The way Mary stood when she forgave him. The way she set a table like it was a promise. But he chose the smallest truth. "She taught me to leave the porch light on," he said. "Not because anyone's coming, because someone might." A hush fell, soft and grateful. In the back, a maintenance man leaned against the doorframe and wiped an eye like he was dusting. After the circle, a young administrator approached, holding a padded envelope. "A man dropped this off," she said. "No return address. He said it was a symbol, and that you'd know what to do with it." Calvin opened it carefully. Inside lay a simple, scuffed key threaded on a thin chain, the number 239 stamped into the metal. Thomas inhaled sharply. "The old P.O. box," he whispered. Calvin nodded, thumb tracing the numbers like braille for the past. On a folded card, 4 words in careful printing. "For the doors ahead." No signature, just a small drawn circle, a ring or a sun or both. Calvin slipped the key into his pocket. "We'll hang this at the front desk," he said, "so anyone who walks in knows we're planning to open more than files." They stayed late long after the bakery next door flipped its sign to closed. Volunteers stacked chairs. Someone played a hymn on a battered keyboard. Thomas stood beside the bulletin board, pinning up a fresh card with Mary's line in his own handwriting. "Leave the light on." Lydia snapped a photo. "For the book," she said. "What book?" Thomas asked. "The one people read when they think they're alone," she answered. When they finally stepped back into the cold, the city glittered in 1,000 windows, small squares of warmth insisting on themselves. Calvin took his son's arm. "Tomorrow, Franklin," he said. Then Greenridge. "Then anywhere Mercy is running out." Thomas nodded. "We'll refill it." They walked toward the car, the key warm in Calvin's pocket, the night not dark so much as unfinished, like a sentence Mary had started and trusted them to complete with the right word. Mercy. They reached Franklin at dusk, the town where Mary had once volunteered before the Mercy Protocol ever existed. The sun spilled gold across the steeple of St. Augustine's, the same church that had held her memorial. Calvin hadn't been back since that day. Thomas parked the car in silence. For a long time, neither of them moved. Then Calvin said quietly, "Let's go in before I change my mind." Inside, the air smelled like candle wax and rain. The pews had been polished since the last time he'd sat there, palms sweating, grief turning every breath into confession. Now someone had hung a new banner across the altar. "Blessed are those who choose repair over revenge." A voice echoed softly from the front. We kept it up after the trial. It was Pastor Dean, older now, shoulders rounded but eyes still sharp. "Mary's story taught us something this church had forgotten," he said. "That confession isn't weakness. It's the start of grace." He led them to a small room behind the nave, a community pantry lined with shelves of canned goods and folded blankets. "This used to be storage. he said. Now it's hope. Thomas ran a hand along a crate labeled Mary's Shelf. Inside were notes and envelopes, little folded papers from townspeople, each signed in gratitude. Calvin picked one up. You saved my daughter's life even after yours ended. Another read, because of Mary, I found the courage to admit I was wrong. He felt the words settle inside him like warmth in a house that had been cold too long. The pastor watched him quietly. She built this, he said. Not with sermons, but with hours. You both are just continuing the shift. Calvin smiled faintly. She always said mercy was a night job. They stayed until the candles burned low, listening to the choir rehearse a hymn Mary had loved. As they left, Pastor Dean pressed something into Calvin's hand, a small wooden cross, edges smooth from use. She carved it while waiting for you once, he said. Said she didn't mind waiting. Said mercy takes time. Calvin's throat closed. She was right, he whispered. From Franklin, they drove east to Greenridge, where an old textile warehouse had been turned into a rehabilitation center. The building hummed with new purpose, classrooms where addicts taught each other accounting, a kitchen where laughter covered the scent of burnt toast, and a mural on the exterior wall. Mary's face rendered in mosaic tile. A volunteer named Maya guided them through. We named each wing after one of her quotes, she said, pointing to the plaques. Stay. Tell the truth. Do no harm. In the courtyard, survivors gathered around a long wooden table painting small stones with words, hope, begin, alive. They pressed the stones into the soil beneath a young oak. Every spring, Maya explained, the roots push the words deeper. By now, we figure the tree knows mercy by heart. Thomas crouched beside one of the kids. Maybe 16, maybe 20, hard to tell beneath the scars of survival. You writing something? He asked. The boy nodded. Yeah. He turned the stone to show the word again. Thomas smiled. Good choice. Calvin watched from a few feet away, the wind carrying snippets of laughter and paint-flecked conversation. For the first time, he realized the foundation wasn't just a place. It was a language, one Mary had written, and the world was still learning to speak. Maya handed him a sealed envelope. Someone dropped this off last month, she said. Said it was meant for you. Inside was a photograph, a grainy image of a man standing in the courtyard of a prison infirmary, tending to a patient's arm. The back read, in familiar handwriting, still staying. Lyle Carson. Calvin's hand trembled, but his smile didn't fade. He showed it to Thomas. Think she'd forgive him? Thomas asked. She already did, Calvin said softly. Now he's just learning how to forgive himself. They stood for a while beneath the oak tree, the stones glinting like tiny suns in the dirt. Then Calvin reached into his pocket and placed something at the tree's base, the key from the envelope weeks ago. For the doors ahead, he murmured, and the ones behind. That night, back at their motel, Thomas sat by the window watching the streetlights blink in steady rhythm. You know, he said, I used to think Mom died trying to save you. Calvin turned to him, eyebrows raised. Thomas smiled faintly. Now I think she was trying to save all of us, so we'd have something left to build with. Calvin nodded. She did. He reached over, turned off the lamp, and let the room fill with the soft hum of distant traffic, the sound of mercy still moving somewhere out there in the dark. Not finished, just ongoing. On a Sunday morning washed clean by spring rain, Calvin Whitaker stood once more at the front of St. Augustine's Church, the same place where, 9 years earlier, he had sat numb in the third pew, watching his wife's coffin disappear beneath lilies and platitudes. Now the lilies were gone. In their place, rows of chairs held faces, neighbors, students, patients, strangers who'd once known Mary's name only from headlines. The sanctuary smelled faintly of candle smoke and lemon oil. A banner hung from the choir loft, simple white letters on blue cloth. Mercy is never a crime. Lydia stood off to the side, camera resting at her hip. Thomas sat in the front row, his hands folded around the small wooden cross Pastor Dean had given his father. Calvin cleared his throat and began, not with a sermon, but with a story. "There was a time," he said, "when I thought truth and love were opposites. I thought telling the truth meant hurting someone, and loving them meant keeping quiet. I was wrong. Love without truth is pity. Truth without love is cruelty. Mary taught me the only thing strong enough to hold both is mercy." He looked across the crowd, a sea of faces marked by loss and stubborn hope. We live in a world that teaches us to choose sides, justice or compassion, punishment or grace, but Mary refused to choose. She believed that accountability and forgiveness could share the same table. He paused. She was right. From the back of the room, a young woman lifted a small child onto her hip. Calvin smiled gently. Some of you here knew her, some didn't. But every one of you has been touched by what she built, by the idea that no one is too late to start over. That's why we're here today. Not to close a story, but to keep turning its pages. He held up the key, the same one he'd carried since that night in Chicago. This belonged to Mary. I used to think it opened something I'd lost, but now I think it opens what's still ahead. Thomas stepped forward and placed a small wooden box on the altar, the same box that had once held Mary's letters, now engraved with one phrase, "For the doors ahead." Calvin slipped the key inside and closed the lid. "Mercy," he said softly, "belongs to those brave enough to leave the door open." The congregation rose in silence. Then someone began to hum, that same tune from Mary's piano, soft and uncertain, until the rest joined in. The melody filled the hall like morning light flooding through stained glass. When the song ended, Calvin spoke one last time. "For years, I thought family was something proven by blood, something you're born into, something you can lose. But I've learned that family isn't about inheritance. It's about integrity. It's the people who stay when leaving would be easier. Family isn't who shares your name. It's who protects your truth. So if you remember anything from Mary's life, or from mine, remember this. Real family isn't bound by blood, but by respect and love." A hush fell, heavy and luminous. Then came applause. Not loud, but long, like gratitude trying to take physical form. Calvin stepped down from the altar. Thomas met him halfway, wrapping his arms around his father for the first time without hesitation, without shame. "You did it," he whispered. Calvin shook his head, smiling. "We did. She just showed us the way." Outside, the church doors opened to sunlight so bright it hurt. The courtyard was filled with white roses, dozens of them planted in the same soil where Mary had once dreamed of a garden for the patients she couldn't save. A little girl tugged on Calvin's sleeve. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "my mom says mercy started with your wife. Is that true?" He knelt, eye level with her. "No, sweetheart," he said. Mercy starts every time someone decides not to give up. The girl grinned, running off to chase her friends among the rose bushes. Thomas watched her go, then looked back at his father. "You ready to head home?" Calvin gazed at the sky, wide, bright, open, and nodded. "Home's wherever mercy lives," he said. As they walked away from the church, the wind carried the echo of Mary's piano. Faint, but certain. It wasn't a haunting anymore. It was a benediction. Lydia filmed their silhouettes disappearing down the street, sunlight haloing their shoulders. Later, she would post it with a caption that read, "Mercy doesn't end when the story does. It just finds new hands to hold it." And beneath it, a single line of text glowed across screens and hearts alike. A call, a promise, a closing note that sounded like hope itself. Follow us. The next story will begin where mercy left off.